Vienna has a long history, dating back to the 1st century CE Roman military camp of Vindobona. It was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is now the capital of Austria. And it's been home to some pretty big names over the centuries. Mozart, Beethoven, Sigmund Freud, Gustav Klimt, Hedy Lamarr, Marie Antoinette and Erwin Schrödinger, among many others, have all lived in the city. Yet it's also got a darker side. Its vast central cemetery is a testament to the Viennese fascination with death. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, nicknamed Sissi, apparently had a fascination with the supernatural, and some say she still roams the hallways of the Hofburg palace. So let's go and explore a handful of these tales in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you're well. We are continuing with the theme of European city legends this week, and this is technically the 6th instalment because I have actually done 4 episodes of European city ghost stories. I think it was sometime last year, and then obviously I started it again this month. So it was Helsinki last week, and this week is Vienna. But before we go any further, this week's episode is brought to you by Sweet William, which meant gallantry in the Victorian language of flowers. I've actually remembered to put that in, which is nice. But like I said, we are having a look at Vienna this week, and Vienna is an absolutely beautiful city. I was there in 2015, absolutely loved it, and would love to go back. But obviously I should also put a little bit of a content warning in. These are obviously stories to do with ghosts and hauntings and so on, so obviously there is violence, there is mention of people unaliving themselves and so on, so if that is going to be a little bit much for you, then obviously feel free to skip this episode. Otherwise, let's go and explore Blutgasse, or Blood Alley, which is actually part of Vienna's first district, Blutgassenviertel, and its history actually dates to the Middle Ages. Now, the street wasn't always called Blutgasse because between 1368 and 1392, people called it Kothgasel, which actually means Feces Alley, so it gives you an idea of the kind of street that it might have been. And it also makes me think of London's Sherburn Lane, which is quite nice now, which in the 1270s was called Shitbower Lane, which later became Shiteburn Lane. So, I know I don't usually swear on the podcast, but that is literally what people called the street. So kind of having Feces Alley in Vienna, not that different. But Blutgasse became the street's official name in 1862, and according to legend, a group of Knights Templar were murdered in the street in 1312 during the somewhat violent dissolution of their order. Now, they tried to hide in the cellars at number 3, but then they were dragged out into the street where they met their sticky end, and the street apparently got its name from all the blood that flowed along it. Now, researchers have since debunked this story as being nothing more than urban myth, and there is also a second possible explanation that a nearby slaughterhouse discharged waste into the street, also giving it the name Blood Alley. Again, some people weren't really sure if that was true either, but I think between the two it's slightly more plausible. But as you would imagine about a street with such a name, it does also have an associated ghost story, because according to some, Blutgasse led to one of Vienna's execution sites, and condemned prisoners made their way along the alley, and then some people think that their ghosts continue to make this journey over and over. I'm less inclined to believe that story because Blutgasse opens out onto just an ordinary street, not a public square, and public squares tend to be the places used for execution sites. And it also lies some 350 metres to the southeast of Hohermarkt, which was the city's execution site in the 14th and 19th centuries, so that's why I'm a little bit less inclined to believe that one. But what's really interesting is if you walk along Blutgasse, then you hit a corner where it turns into Domgasse, and that's where you will find the Mozart house at number 8. And the composer Wolfgang Mozart lived here between 1784 and 1787, and he composed The Marriage of Figaro here, among others, which kind of explains why the house is sometimes also called the Figaro house. Now, I don't know how true this following legend is, and in fact, I think it probably isn't true at all. But I absolutely adore Mozart's music. It was absolutely fascinating to visit the Mozart house in the Old Town, and I just thought it was such a cool legend. I had to include it because it's not the usual kind of thing that I focus on in these city ghost stories, so I thought we'll have a look at it anyway. So in the story, a masked messenger comes to the apartment one night with a commission for Mozart. Now, it sounds like an interesting project, but there's one condition. He can't talk about the piece with anyone. Mozart's like, money's money, composing's composing, fine, I will do it. So he takes the job on and gets to work. But the longer he works on this, and it's a requiem that he's been asked to compose, the more he starts to question the masked messenger. Who was he? Who did he work for? And worse, did he even exist? And apparently Mozart began to fear the messenger actually came from the other world. So the requiem wasn't a commission for someone else. Nope, it was supposed to be the music played at his own funeral, which is pretty goth if you ask me. But despite this belief, Mozart still continued to work night and day to finish it, so, he was nothing if not consistent. The sad thing was, he never actually completed it because he died of kidney failure aged 35 on the 5th of December 1791. Now, according to legend, the Requiem was part one of the pieces played at his funeral, and you would absolutely recognise the Lacrimosa section because it gets played on adverts and in films and all sorts quite a lot. But is the story true? Now, I desperately want it to be because it's just kind of so goth, but Count Franz von Walsegg actually commissioned the Requiem for a service in 1792 to mark the first anniversary of his wife's death. So composer Franz Xavier Sussmayer actually completed the Requiem and then delivered it in 1792, so that's why we have a finished piece. There are actually suggestions that Walsegg wanted to claim the authorship of the Requiem for himself, and apparently had done so with other works. And obviously if he's basically then told Mozart, you can't tell anyone that you've done this, it would be much easier for him to do. But Mozart's widow Constance wasn't going to let that happen, and she sounds amazing because she was the one who actually started the stories of the masked messenger and Mozart's belief that the Requiem for his own funeral. So she was the one who started the stories of the masked messenger and the fact that Mozart apparently believed that the Requiem was for his own funeral. So she sort of started all of these at a performance intended to raise money for her, obviously as a widow, but obviously stories like that stick, so it's quite difficult for Walsegg to then say, oh yeah, no, I wrote it, if everyone's going, oh my god, have you heard these legends about Mozart, because he would have been incredibly famous at the time. So that's why obviously Mozart's authorship kind of lived on. So I love the fact that, like, in this particular instance, like, folklore ends up working in the favour of the person who kind of spreads it, if that makes sense. So I had to include that one, A, because it was Mozart, and B, I just thought, fair play to her, absolutely fair play to her. So she obviously managed to get Mozart recognised as the author of at least part of it, and obviously then Sussmayer does have the credit for a couple of the other pieces as well. And we're going to go on to another celebrity of a completely different type, and this is also a returning feature, as it were, to the podcast, because it's somebody that I've featured before. And if we go to Augustinstrasse 12, it looks fairly unremarkable from the outside, I'm not going to lie. But in the early 17th century, Elisabeth Bathory apparently spent winters here, and obviously there is an entire episode on her. And obviously, you probably know the legend that Bathory was one of these people who just collected young people and then either bathed in their blood or drank their blood, depending on the version of the story, after torturing young women because she was supposed to believe that this is what would keep her young and beautiful. You can listen to the full episode if you want to hear another side of that particular story. But in this particular instance, according to legend, one of Bathory's servants was sourcing a stream of young maids to work at this particular house in Vienna, who were then never seen again by their families. And some of them did end up going on to Bathory's castle, others were employed at the Hungarian house, as it was known in Vienna. And there were reports of weird noises at night, and that apparently they were so bad that the Augustinian monks across the street actually threw earthenware at the house, shouting at them to keep the noise down, which I think is an absolutely weird mental image. Now, the house isn't open to the public, but some people claim that you can still hear howls of pain coming from the building. And there did used to be tours of the building, although the torture was supposed to have happened in the attic and the cellar. Now, I'm still not convinced that Bathory was the bloodthirsty villain that history paints it to be, and again, you can listen to the episode to find out why. True, people would be unlikely to question a wealthy and powerful woman about screams coming from her house, but my question is how much were the stories attached to the house after her trial, once she was already notorious, and how many of them date to the time of her actual residence there. The fact that people claim that they still hear screams coming from the house now, again, if you know that that is the house associated with Elisabeth Bathory, then again, how much of that is coming from prior knowledge? If you had no idea that that was what that house was, fair enough. But as I say, I'm a little bit dubious, but I still thought it was an interesting link to a previous episode. And as I said in the Helsinki episode, it wouldn't really be a Fabulous Folklore episode without some kind of graveyard. This is kind of where we sort of seem to be now. Like, if I do any visits to other places, there's a graveyard involved, always. And there's actually several in Vienna, and the Central Cemetery, which is the absolutely massive one, would have been the obvious choice, but I actually wanted to have a look at the Friedhof der Namenlosen, or Cemetery of the Nameless, because it's more special in many ways, and it's the final resting place of people who drowned in the Danube. Now, naturally, these people found different ways into the Danube in the first place. Some of them were murdered, others had suffered accidents of some description, and I dare say some people had put themselves into the river. And there was a whirlpool in the river which caught both driftwood and dead bodies, so obviously they would fish the bodies out, and then they would bury them at this cemetery almost immediately. Now, this means that many of the victims don't have headstones, but they've just got simple wrought iron crosses that mark the graves instead. Sometimes they might have male or female. Sometimes they might have the date when the body washed up on them. Most of the graves have nothing to say who is buried there, and their plaques read things like Namenlos or Nameless or Unbekannt and Unknown and things like that. Now, the cemetery does actually exist in two halves now, so you've got the earlier half which predates 1900, and that's almost entirely overgrown and inaccessible, and then the newer part is on the other side of the dam, and 104 people were buried there between 1900 and 1940. Only 43 were identified, and many of these identifications are due to the tireless work of Josef Fuchs, who was a volunteer gravedigger. He researched the bodies that he retrieved from the river, and then he actually managed to identify all but one of the bodies that he buried himself, which is why some of the plaques do actually have a bit of information about the person on them. And he looked after the graves until he died aged 90 in 1996. Now, thankfully, bodies no longer wash up here due to the construction of a port and grain silo, so the river just basically moves differently. But why have I put this in an episode about folklore? Well, I wanted to include it partly to draw attention to Fuchs, who was tirelessly working to ensure that people didn't remain nameless in death. And I think that kind of dedication to a cause and trying to sort of give people a bit of dignity after death, I think that kind of act really does get overlooked in our society quite a lot of the time. So I thought, I want to give him his props for that. But there is also an annual remembrance for those in the cemetery, which obviously when you look at these kind of annual rites and traditions and so on, do become part of the folklore of a city. So members of the Alburn Fishing Association gather on the first Sunday afternoon following All Saints' Day, obviously which is 1st of November. They build a raft and then they decorate that with flowers and wreaths and burning candles, and then they launch that onto the Danube. And they basically follow it along the river, pushing it along if it gets stuck on the bank until the river then claims it, and it's their way of showing remembrance for all of the people who are buried in that particular cemetery. And I just thought that was really quite sweet that people continue to mark these individuals who might otherwise have gone completely unnoticed and unremarked. And our final story is a bit of an odd one, because I wanted to end with a more typical story, but there's about 3 different things going on at once in this particular story, and this involves the Katzensteig house. And according to local legend, a white cat is linked with it, and bad luck follows anyone who sees her, which is so far so typical of folklore. But the story continues, because a woman apparently decided to kill her lover's wife so that she could have her lover for herself, and she decided to use poison, but then inadvertently poisoned herself instead of the man's wife. Following her death, she now roams across the rooftops as a cat in the area around the Katzensteig house. No, I don't know why that would be the logical outcome either. The story isn't clear as to why she's associated with that specific house, unless either she or her lover lived there, and there's not really anything to explain what's going on in this. So obviously the white cat being bad luck, I can understand that being part of folklore, but I'm not quite sure when this bit about the lovers and whatnot got added on. And again, the fact that there's no names or anything involved always kind of make me a little bit sceptical. But then it goes on even further, so we then have the next layer, because people believe the house itself is generally unlucky, because a fire broke out in 1522 which completely destroyed the house. No one knows what started it, seems to have been quite a mystery. And then it was rebuilt, and then the rebuilt building collapsed in 1590 during an earthquake. And even now, tenants apparently never last long, with the building often left unoccupied. Now, the implication here is that the building somehow drives off those who try to live or work there, although it's unclear why. Many such properties end up being linked with terrible crimes on the site, but this one isn't, as far as I can tell. And much of the ominous atmosphere seems to come from the basement, and according to one of the paranormal investigation companies in the city, there is a wooden chair in the basement that sets off EMF meters, even though it's nowhere near any electrical wiring. And apparently they actually have moved it into different locations around the basement, and it doesn't matter where they put it, which does actually indicate there is something weird going on, because the whole point of an EMF meter is it detects sort of electrical current. That's why it's an electrician's tool. Ultimately, like, my dad's got one. If he wants to drill in the wall, he will use the EMF meter to check that there's not an electrical current behind the wall where he's going to drill, so he doesn't drill through a live wire. That's essentially how you can use them for like practical reasons. So if you're holding one and you're nowhere near a source of electricity and it suddenly goes off for no reason, the implication for paranormal investigators is that there must be something that is creating that kind of electromagnetic radiation to set off the meter. So if you have that going off next to a chair, which is made of wood and therefore not a source of electricity anyway, if you've got that going on and it's happening no matter where you put it, and I'm assuming they're checking the area around it. So if you sort of check the chair and it sets it off and you take the chair away and then it doesn't go off, then clearly you haven't picked up something next to the wall or whatever. So it does sound a little bit unusual, and that did kind of pique my interest because EMF meters are a little bit, I think, easier to believe because of the fact that it's picking up like an actual thing to set it off. But we then have to ask, is the chair the source of the disturbances, which is really unlikely if the building faced bad luck in the 16th century and the chair clearly isn't that old, or is the basement the problem? Is that somehow the one thing that's always remained across all of the buildings? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. There are other legends that do abound in Vienna, although often all that survives is a fragment or a juicy snippet, and they're enough to kind of create like a frisson of creepiness, but that's not really enough to sustain a podcast episode. And I have to admit, as with the other European cities that I've covered, it's obvious why stories like this congregate in cities. Humans rub up against each other in pretty large volumes and for long periods of time, so there's a lot of human activity and a lot of stories. People tell each other those stories and then they morph with every retelling. Though I should say, if you do head to Vienna, and I highly recommend that you do, keep your wits about you, because who knows which of their famous celebrities you might meet even after death. So I hope that you enjoyed that particular episode on Vienna. As I say, I absolutely love Vienna as a city. It is so pretty. I really, really enjoy being there. It's a really big fan. And next week we're going to Strasbourg, which I also really liked, I should point out. And we'll be having a look at some of the different ghost stories and things associated with Strasbourg. And again, I haven't decided what we're doing for the final week in this month, so you'll find out when I realise what I'm going to do. As always, reviews are lovely on the different websites, basically because it's an algorithm thing. If people leave reviews, it sort of tells the algorithm to then recommend the podcast to other people, and it just means that we can kind of spread what Fabulous Folklore is trying to do to a wider audience. And also you can just tell a friend, which is nice as well. So anyway, it's been lovely chatting with you, as always. And I will see you next week when we toddle off to Strasbourg. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.